Welcome back to Inside the Family. My name is Aspen, and in this week's episode, we're delving into generational trauma and abuse in families, specifically how this can impact the relationship between parent and child, both growing up and as adults. This is an extremely important topic in today's world because as of 2021, there was an estimated 588,000 children that were victims of child abuse or maltreatment. 78.8% of these cases were perpetrated by their parents or primary caregivers who see the children the most. This equates roughly to 8.1 children per 1,000 victims annually, and that number only increases each year. Learning the mechanisms behind generational trauma and how it spreads through generations allows people to tackle the root of the cause and allows them to focus on very specific areas to protect their future families. As someone who grew up in a family with deeply rooted generational trauma, both from my father and my stepmother, this is something that's so important to me to protect my future family. Before getting into the specifics on generational trauma, I do want to address some risk factors to premeditating abuse, both through generations and standalone situations. One of the largest risk factors for child abuse and maltreatment specifically is socioeconomic status. Intergenerational abuse is linked very closely with intergenerational poverty, as there's quite a bit more struggles that families are facing in poverty, such as children having to be parentified or grow up too quickly to take on roles that their parents otherwise would do, but they're at work to make a living and try and survive. There's also child abuse playing a role in lower graduation, unemployment, and poverty rates. Lower graduation often means these kids had to do something that made their education take a back burner. And since these kids are so used to what they're seeing in their families, there's a higher chance that if they're not socializing with people their own age frequently, that they're not going to recognize these behaviors as bad as they are, which continues this cycle. In an article titled The Intergenerational Impact of Trauma and Family Violence on Parents and Their Children, there's a very intense highlight on how intergenerational violence occurs when the abuse affects several generations and the greater risk of violence being transferred between these generations because these behaviors are normalized. The article also highlights that parents with a history of child abuse and neglect, otherwise known as CAN, are 3 times more likely to maltreat their own children than parents without this history. They don't see that yelling and hitting your child is something that is not normal to the public because it was so normalized to them as children. 1/3 of child abuse and neglect survivors also exhibit trauma symptoms, and as an adult, exhibiting those trauma symptoms often passes to young children, which they internalize because they leech off of your energy. For example, when a child hits their head or bumps their head, oftentimes they'll look to their parent before they cry. If their parent starts overreacting and gets really anxious, then the child will cry. If the child sees the parent laughing, often they laugh as well because they aren't injured, they just got a little bump on their head. Additionally, this study showed that the intergenerational effect of trauma for both mothers and fathers in violent families was prevalent. However, there was a higher risk factor for women in relationships facing IPV or interpersonal violence and showing trauma symptoms passing on to their kids rather than the fathers, because typically interpersonal violent relationships often harm more women than men, statistically speaking. There's also a mention in the article that in order to break the cycle of generational abuse, the parents need to be aware of the issue. And when addressing trauma in children due to child abuse, there also needs to be an addressing to the parents who might not recognize that this is something deeply rooted due to their own past. Often breaking the cycle will involve therapy just because abuse is a learned behavior that you learn quite young in life. Something this article gives way to explore are ACEs, or Adverse Childhood Experiences. It's a questionnaire consisting of different questions to assess how many of these ACEs you've experienced in your life. Some of the questions they ask are like, have you ever lived with someone that was incarcerated? Have you been sexually abused as a child? Have you been yelled at or hit by your parents? Have you witnessed your parents hitting each other? An interpersonal violence example. Or have you ever been told as a child that you were worthless or unworthy of love? More frequently, the higher the ACE score, the lower score you have of positive childhood experiences, which could offset these if there were enough. But if you have a higher ACE score, that gives way for psychologists to go, okay, so these are possible mental health conditions you might have. These are possible physical conditions you should look out for, because sometimes there's a link between childhood trauma and chronic illnesses. In the International Journal of Environmental Research and Public Health, an article titled Intergenerational Transmission of Trauma, the Mediating Effects of Family Health, focused on determining the intergenerational transmission of trauma between parents and their children. Their study confirmed that both parents can pass this trauma on to their kids, but there's especially a link between mothers and their children. The study supported the mediating role of positive childhood experiences as aforementioned, but based on the study findings, improvement of family health can reduce the impact of intergenerational transmission of trauma. But what happens if family health doesn't improve? Family health is things like the way you communicate with your parents, the way your attachment style is developed as a child, dysfunctional family dynamics versus functional family dynamics. If this transmission of trauma isn't addressed and isn't mediated by positive childhood experiences, you can suffer from quite a plethora of things in your adult life. And those things were described in the role of current family relationships and associations between childhood abuse and adult psychological functioning. They found in that study that verbal and physical child abuse negatively affected aspects of family relationships in later adulthood, such as less perceived support, more perceived strain, less frequent contact, and fewer hours of providing support when in conversation with your parents. As an adult, you can also see a lot of mental health impacts on child abuse and trauma that can further this cycle generationally, such as maladaptive coping mechanisms like substance abuse, self-harm, and compulsive behaviors. Abuse by primary caregivers can hinder the child's ability to form secure attachments, which can harm relationships later in adult life, whether it's friendship or romantic. And then there's a big problem in some families with parentification, where a child is forced to tackle on roles of an adult at a very young age, such as providing emotional support to a parent or caretaking for a younger sibling that might also be potentially neglected. And this can lead to social isolation, strained relationships with your parent and peers, because you are in a mindset that is a lot more mature than most of the people your age might be. For example, I took care of my baby sister when I was 11, and it caused a massive strain on relationships I was trying to build in middle school, because I didn't know how to be a middle schooler and a high schooler, because I would go to school and then I'd go home and be a parent while also trying to be a kid. I interviewed my friend Kay during this project because I wanted to get an understanding of how a different form of generational trauma that perpetrated her family impacted her. She had a cycle in her family of the women were in a lot of abusive relationships, whether it was emotionally abusive or physically abusive. Her great-grandmother, grandmother, and mom all were involved in these relationships, and Kay witnessed firsthand a ripple effect from her grandmother and her mother's side. Her great-grandmother was physically abused by her first husband. She remarried later on in life and had Kay's grandmother. Kay's grandmother was in an abusive relationship, which Kay attributes to possibly underlying mental illnesses that Kay's great-grandmother suffered from, which showed through abuse to Kay's grandmother. The cycle of being emotionally abusive in relationships further continued with Kay's mother, as Kay's grandmother didn't have the tools and resources to be aware of the ways her mom acted that affected her actions, which then ultimately affected Kay's mother's actions, which primarily showed when Kay was around 11 to 15, suffering with her mental and physical health, while her mom was cheating on her partners because she had a fear of abandonment, which Kay thinks is because one of her mother's mother, so Kay's grandmother's partners, did leave them with very, very little. I believe it was Kay's grandmother's first husband. Kay recognizes the abuse she endured through her mother's consistent cheating and various boyfriends over the years. She also recognizes the ways in which her mom behaved because of potentially an attachment disorder that Kay's not really sure specifically what it was. Ultimately, she reflects and recognizes the good and bad from her childhood and notes things she would and wouldn't change if she ever had kids of her own, or most primarily interacting with future nieces and nephews. This step in recognizing where things fell through with her family and how the abuse she endured was caused by outside factors that impacted her family over the years, Kay thinks has strengthened her relationship with her family because there's an awareness to it, there's an understanding to it, and Kay knows that if her family had different outcomes with their partners, there's a very high likelihood that this trauma wouldn't have passed down through the generations. And recognizing is the first step in healing, recovering, and stopping this cycle of trauma and abuse. Before we wrap up this week's episode of Inside the Family, I do want to take a moment to address and recognize the TikTok trend of ranking struggle meals I ate as a kid. I've seen that on my For You page a lot during this research, and it gives me hope for the future, because the comments of the videos are always like, hey, this was neglect, are you okay now? And as scary as it is to be the person on the other side of that video or that comment where someone's like, hey Diva, you good? I think it gives people things to bring up, things to explore through therapy, or whatever means they have to work through something they endured as a child, that are healthy coping mechanisms, and allows them to address behaviors that might be maladaptive coping mechanisms or left over from residual from their family and how their family operated. And it's hopeful because they have that in their toolbox. They could work on it. They could prevent that from going and being passed to their future kids now that they have awareness of it if they didn't before. There's CPS workers posting like, hey, I know to look out for this when I'm going on home visits. Is there something else I should look out for? And again, there's comments where people are like, oh, look out for this. And someone replies saying, I didn't know that was abuse. And it gives people so much to think about, so much to reflect on, but also the awareness that, hey, what happened to you wasn't your fault. Like, you were just a kid. You didn't deserve that. And I think a lot of people forget that sometimes. And as hard as this topic was for me to research personally at times, it fills me with so much hope for the future and what the future holds for so many people across the globe that I've never met before, but are part of this statistic of kids abused by their parents annually. And I think the kids will be all right. I think future generations, generational trauma is always going to be a problem. There's always going to be people who don't recognize it and aren't able to help themselves to prevent it from going to their kids. But there's also so many people that are aware of it because of social media and social media trends like that. And it just gives me so much hope for the future of this generation's kids. Thank you so much for tuning into Inside of the Family, and we'll catch you next week.